The storm came without warning, a white wall of wind and silence swallowing the mountains of Wyoming. Inside a lonely cabin, a Navy SEAL named Jack Mercer sat awake, staring at a world he no longer belonged to. Then, a sound, soft, fragile, a scratching at the door. When he opened it, 2 tiny German shepherd puppies stood there, their fur crusted with ice, their eyes pleading through the snow. No one knew how they had survived that far. No one knew how much he needed them to. What happened next would remind the world that even broken soldiers can be chosen by miracles. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Winter had already claimed the mountains of northern Wyoming. The valley below lay buried beneath layers of untouched white, every pine branch sagging under its weight, every sound swallowed by the slow rhythm of falling snow. The wind carried with it a faint, mournful hum, the kind that could make even the living feel like ghosts. Far beyond the last sign of town, a small wooden cabin sat alone at the edge of the bighorn forest, smoke curling weakly from its chimney. Inside, Jack Mercer sat in silence. Jack was 38, tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose posture still carried the discipline of a soldier long after he'd left the field. His hair was dark brown with a hint of gray, trimmed short, but no longer in military precision. A light stubble shadowed his jaw, the kind that grew when a man stopped caring how he looked. His face, angular and tired, bore the faint lines of years spent under harsh suns and sleepless nights. There was something in his eyes, a pale steel blue, that hinted at both strength and sorrow, as if he saw things others couldn't, and wished he didn't. He had served 12 years as a Navy SEAL, before a mission in the Afghan mountains ended with one survivor, him. That single fact followed him like a shadow. The cabin was quiet, except for the creak of the wood stove and the soft hum of the storm outside. Jack leaned back in an old chair, a mug of black coffee untouched beside him. He had stopped counting the days since he'd left the base. Time here didn't move in hours, only in seasons, and this winter felt endless. The world beyond these walls didn't need him anymore, and he no longer knew how to exist without a mission. Then, through the storm's low growl, came a sound. At first, he thought it was the wind shifting the shutters. Then it came again. Faint, rhythmic, hesitant, a scratching at the door. Jack frowned. Out here, there were no neighbors for miles. He stood slowly, the joints in his knees aching with the reminder of old injuries. As he approached the door, the scratching turned into a small whimper. He hesitated, his pulse quickening, not with fear, but with something unfamiliar, concern. He pulled open the door. Snow rushed in, and for a moment he saw nothing but white. Then through the haze, 2 tiny shapes appeared. 2 German shepherd puppies stood trembling on his porch. Their fur, once black and tan, was now matted with frost and clinging ice. They couldn't have been more than 6 weeks old, small enough that their paws looked too large for their bodies. One stood slightly ahead of the other, its ears half folded, its eyes wide and pleading. The smaller one pressed against its sibling, shivering so hard its teeth chattered audibly. Then the braver one lifted a paw and placed it gently against the wooden doorframe, as if knocking. Jack's throat tightened. For a long moment, he simply stared. He'd seen creatures dying in deserts and jungles, comrades bleeding in the dirt, but he had never seen desperation this pure. The instinct drilled into him over years of rescue operations kicked in. Assess, act, protect. He crouched down slowly. "Where did you come from, huh?" His voice came out rough from disuse. The braver pup tilted its head at the sound, taking one shaky step forward before collapsing into the snow. Without another thought, Jack scooped them both up. They were cold, terrifyingly cold, their fur stiff with ice, their bodies limp from exhaustion. He kicked the door shut behind him and laid them on an old wool blanket near the stove. Steam began to rise as the snow melted from their coats. One whimpered softly, the other just breathed, shallow but steady. Jack fetched a towel, rubbing them gently, careful not to startle them. "Easy, little warriors," he muttered, the words slipping out naturally, like a habit from long ago. He reached for his old navy jacket hanging by the wall and wrapped them inside it. The heavy fabric looked absurdly large around their tiny bodies, but soon their shivering began to slow. He stared at them, at the rise and fall of two fragile chests. A thought he didn't want to have came unbidden. "They'll die if you don't do something." He rose quickly, rummaging through cabinets until he found an old can of chicken broth. The smell filled the cabin as it warmed, mingling with the scent of wood smoke. When he poured a small amount into a bowl and set it down, the smaller pup sniffed uncertainly, then began to lap at it with weak, trembling licks. The other followed, more cautiously, but just as hungry. Jack watched, something tight in his chest slowly loosening. "You've got fight in you," he said softly. "That's good. You're gonna need it." Outside, the storm howled louder, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The wind rattled the frame, but inside the cabin, the air grew warmer, not from the stove, but from life returning to the room. Jack sat cross-legged on the floor, the puppies now curled against each other in a tangle of black and tan. He felt the faint weight of them against his leg, their breathing slow and even. He hadn't realized how empty the silence had been until it was broken. Across the valley, another small farmhouse stood against the storm. Through her frosted window, Evelyn Brooks noticed a faint light flicker from the direction of Jack Mercer's cabin. Evelyn was 66, tall and slender, her silver hair tied in a loose braid over one shoulder. Her face was gentle, but lined by years of wind and worry. Her gray eyes calm, yet endlessly curious. She had been a teacher for most of her life and had moved to this remote valley after her husband passed away. A quiet man who had once rescued a stray dog during a winter much like this one. She often watched Jack's cabin from afar, concerned for the reclusive veteran who kept to himself. The townsfolk whispered about him. The seal who never speaks. The man who came home but didn't really come back. But Evelyn didn't believe in labeling the broken. She believed in waiting. That sometimes people just needed time to remember they were still part of the world. Tonight, as the storm raged and the mountains disappeared behind curtains of snow, she saw something that made her pause. Movement. The faint outline of a man bending near his doorway, then carrying something inside. She smiled to herself. "Maybe," she murmured. The storm brought him company. Back in the cabin, the fire crackled softly. The two puppies were asleep now, nestled in the folds of Jack's jacket. One twitched as it dreamed, letting out a tiny sigh. Jack sat nearby, elbows on his knees, watching the flames reflect in their fur. The sound of the storm outside faded to a distant hum. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the desert, or the men he couldn't save, or the faces that haunted his sleep. He was thinking about these two little survivors who had somehow found him, and about the impossible timing of it all. He leaned back, feeling the warmth of the fire on his face, the slow, rhythmic breathing beside him. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering his footprints on the porch, erasing the world beyond the window. But inside, for the first time in a long time, something small and quiet began to thaw inside Jack Mercer's chest. He looked down at the sleeping puppies and whispered, almost to himself, "Guess none of us were meant to be alone out here." And as the fire burned low and the wind sighed through the pines, the cabin on the edge of the world felt less like a shelter and more like a beginning. Morning arrived quietly over the valley, a pale gray light sliding across the snow-covered pines. The storm had passed, leaving the world in a hush so still that Jack Mercer could hear the slow crack of ice settling on the roof. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to embers, glowing faintly in the dim light. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, life. Two tiny shapes stirred beneath his old navy jacket, shifting slightly before one let out a small yawn that sounded almost human. Jack sat up on the couch, his body stiff from sleeping upright, and looked toward the blanket. The puppies were awake. He crouched down beside them, his knees popping in protest. One of the pups, bigger, its fur darker and thicker, looked up at him with an unblinking gaze. The other, smaller, had lighter tan fur around its neck and a white mark on its chest shaped like a crooked star. They were both still thin, their ribs faintly visible beneath the fluff. The smaller one took a tentative step forward, then another, and collapsed halfway, its paws splaying out on the wooden floor. The larger one padded over and stood between Jack and its sibling, tail low, body trembling, but protective. "Guard dog already?" Jack murmured, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Guess that makes you the brave one." He reached out a hand, slow and careful. The larger pup sniffed his fingers before pressing its cold nose into his palm. The smaller one followed a moment later, tail wagging weakly. Jack let them climb into his lap, feeling their tiny claws catch against the rough fabric of his pants. It had been years since he'd felt something so small, so trusting. He studied them for a while, the way they leaned on each other, one steady, one curious. "You need names," he said finally. His voice sounded strange in the quiet room, unused to conversation. "You." He pointed at the darker one. "You stick close. Watch everything. Don't back down. Your shadow." The pup tilted its head at the word, as if testing it. Jack chuckled. "And you." He turned to the smaller one. "You keep charging forward, even when you trip over yourself. You're Blaze." The little one barked, a tiny, high-pitched sound that made Jack laugh for the first time in months. "Yeah," he said softly. "Blaze fits." He fed them warm broth again, breaking bits of bread into the bowl until they were full and sleepy. Shadow curled up near the stove, always facing the door. Blaze climbed clumsily into Jack's lap and refused to move. Jack let him stay. The weight of the puppy's breathing against his chest was strangely grounding. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting for the next loss. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded at the door. Not the scratching of claws this time, but the soft, hesitant tap of a hand. Jack froze for a moment before opening it. On the porch stood Evelyn Brooks, bundled in a thick brown coat lined with shearling. Her silver braid hung over one shoulder, half covered by her knitted scarf. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, and she held a small wicker basket in gloved hands. "Morning, Jack." she greeted, her voice warm but careful, as though speaking to someone just waking from a long sleep. "I saw your chimney smoking after the storm. Thought I'd bring some things. Bread, soup, bit of medicine in case those little ones need it." Jack blinked, caught off guard. "How'd you know I had company?" Evelyn smiled. "The valley talks. And I saw you last night, out there in the snow. Hard to miss a man carrying hope in his arms." He stepped aside wordlessly, and she entered, her boots tapping lightly on the floorboards. The cabin was modest, just a stove, a cot, a table, and shelves stacked with old field manuals and canned goods. She looked around, taking in the warmth returning to the space. When her gaze fell on the puppies, her face softened. "Well, aren't you two miracles?" she whispered, kneeling down. Shadow lifted its head, wary but not afraid. Blaze wagged its tail so hard it nearly fell over. Evelyn laughed, a low, melodic sound that filled the room. "They look about 6 weeks, maybe 7. You did well bringing them in, Jack. They'd never have survived that storm." Jack shrugged. "Didn't think, just acted. That's what good men do," she said simply, unpacking her basket. She set down a small tin of salve, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and a thermos. "This is venison stew. It'll keep you and them warm. And if you don't mind my saying, your fire could use more wood. You've got plenty out back, but it looks half buried." Jack raised an eyebrow. "You checking up on me, Miss Brooks?" "Evelyn," she corrected with a gentle smile. "And yes, I suppose I am. Someone has to." He didn't answer, but something in his posture softened. Evelyn stayed a while longer, showing him how to mix goat milk powder into water for the pups, how to rub a little oil into their paws to keep them from cracking in the cold. She moved with a quiet confidence, the kind of grace that came from years of caring for fragile things. As they worked, she told him about her husband, Robert Brooks, who had been a forest ranger. "He used to bring home every stray he found," she said, eyes distant but kind. "One winter, he rescued a fox kit frozen under a fence. I told him we couldn't keep it. He said, 'Then we'll keep it long enough to let it go.'" Jack glanced up. "He sounds like a good man." "He was," she said softly, "and he'd have liked you." They fell into a comfortable silence after that. When Evelyn finally stood to leave, dusk had begun to color the snow outside in shades of violet and blue. She pulled her coat tighter, then looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and care. "You planning to name them?" "Already did," Jack said. "Shadow and Blaze." Her eyes lit with approval. "Strong names. Maybe they'll remind you that even small things can carry strength." Jack nodded once, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," he said instead. "For the soup? For coming by?" Evelyn smiled, her breath a pale mist in the cold air. "Storms don't always take things from us, Jack. Sometimes they bring things we didn't know we needed." With that, she turned and made her way down the path, her footprints fading quickly in the fresh snow. Jack watched until she disappeared beyond the pines. Then he returned to the warmth of the cabin. Blaze had managed to climb onto his old military jacket again, using it as a makeshift bed. Shadow lay nearby, eyes half open, still keeping quiet watch. Jack lowered himself beside them, his body heavy, but his mind lighter than it had been in years. He reached out, running a hand over their soft fur, feeling the steady rhythm of their breathing. Outside, the wind was calm now, whispering through the trees instead of roaring. The cabin no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt alive. Jack leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams glowing in firelight. "Shadow," he murmured. "Blaze." The names felt right on his tongue. Solid, grounding. He closed his eyes and listened to the quiet sounds of their sleep. For the first time in a long time, Jack Mercer smiled. And that smile stayed, faint and genuine, as the snow began to fall again beyond the window, softly this time, like forgiveness. The sun had not yet risen over the frozen valley, but the world outside Jack Mercer's cabin glowed faintly blue under the thin breath of dawn. A brittle silence hung over the trees, interrupted only by the groan of ice shifting along the river. Jack was awake before the light came, feeding the stove, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. Shadow and Blaze were still asleep by the hearth, curled together like mismatched pieces of the same heart. Their fur shimmered under the firelight. Shadow darker, more composed even in slumber. Blaze smaller, restless, a paw twitching as if still chasing something in his dreams. Jack poured himself coffee and watched the snow fall through the frosted window. Life had become almost rhythmic again. Wake, feed the pups, chop wood, mend what time had worn down. Simple, manageable. After years of chaos, the quiet was both a balm and a punishment. But that morning, a strange stillness settled in, a feeling Jack knew too well from his days before a mission, when something unseen waited beyond the horizon. When he turned from the stove, Shadow was awake, staring toward the door. The hairs along his neck stood up. "What is it?" Jack asked softly, but Shadow only whined, pawing at the door. Jack's gaze shifted toward the blanket. It was empty. Blaze was gone. At first, he thought the pup had slipped under the bed or into the pantry, but the more he searched, the tighter his chest grew. There was no sound of small claws on the floor, no faint bark, nothing but the hollow wind pressing against the cabin walls. Panic clawed its way up Jack's throat. He threw on his coat, grabbed his gloves, and opened the door. Cold air cut through him like glass. Tracks, small, uneven paw prints, led away from the porch and down toward the woods. The snow had fallen lightly overnight, soft enough to record each step. Jack knelt to inspect them, his military instincts snapping back like muscle memory. Blaze had wandered off before dawn, alone. "Damn it, kid," he muttered. He looked down at Shadow. "Find him!" The command was barely out before Shadow darted forward, nose close to the ground, tail straight, moving with focused urgency. Jack followed, boots crunching through the snow, his breath fogging in the bitter air. The forest swallowed them quickly, its silence dense and unforgiving. He called out a few times, "Blaze, come on, boy." But his voice vanished into the endless white. As they climbed deeper into the trees, the terrain grew uneven. Snow weighed heavy on the branches, and here and there, old hunting markers still clung to the trunks, remnants of men long gone. Jack's mind betrayed him with flashes of memory, nights in the desert, search missions that ended in silence, the sound of one name shouted into nothing. He forced the thoughts down. Not this time. A sharp bark cut through the wind. Shadow had stopped ahead, pawing at a mound of snow near a fallen log. Jack ran to him, his pulse hammering. He dropped to his knees, brushing the snow aside, and there he was. Blaze. The little pup lay half buried, trembling, his right hind leg caught in an old rusted snare. The metal wire had tightened cruelly, cutting into the fur and skin. Blood, dark against the white snow, had frozen along the edge. Jack's heart sank. "Easy, buddy, easy." He spoke softly, as if calming a wounded soldier. Blaze whimpered, but didn't struggle. Shadow stood close, whining low, his body tense, as though blaming himself for not stopping it. Jack reached for the wire, but his gloves were too thick. He tore them off, ignoring the sting of cold against his fingers. The snare was old but stubborn, twisted around the pup's leg. "Hold on, Blaze. Hold on." His hands shook, not from the cold, but from the memory of kneeling beside another life slipping away, years ago, under a different sky. He forced his breath steady, found the loop's release knot, and pulled. The wire gave, with a reluctant snap. The pup cried out once and went limp against his arm. Jack wrapped him in his coat and pressed his hand against the wound to slow the bleeding. The warmth of the small body against his chest reignited something inside him. Focus, purpose, the instinct that had once defined him. They needed help, real help. He couldn't risk infection or frostbite. Jack stood, clutching Blaze close, and turned toward the valley. "Come on, Shadow," he said. "We're going home." The return felt longer. The snow had thickened, and Jack's breath came in ragged bursts. By the time the cabin came into view, Blaze's breathing was shallow, his fur damp with sweat and blood. Jack burst through the door and laid him by the fire, working quickly. Blanket, warm water, pressure on the wound. But it wasn't enough. He needed disinfectant, clean bandages, supplies he didn't have. He grabbed his radio, the one Evelyn had insisted he keep just in case. Static answered first, then her voice, faint but steady. "Jack, is that you?" "Evelyn, I need help. Blaze got caught in a snare. He's bleeding. I'm on my way. Keep him warm and don't pull the leg straight." Her tone shifted, calm, authoritative. It was the voice of someone who had faced emergencies before and learned not to panic. Within 20 minutes, the sound of a snowmobile broke through the storm's quiet. Evelyn appeared at the door, wrapped in a heavy parka, goggles pushed up onto her forehead. Her face was flushed from the wind, but her eyes were sharp. She moved like a woman who'd done this before. "Let me see him," she said, kneeling beside the pup. She examined the wound with practiced care. "Old trap. Must have been from poachers years back. He's lucky." She looked up at Jack. "You both are." Jack knelt beside her, silent as she cleaned the cut with antiseptic, wrapped it with gauze, and massaged circulation back into Blaze's paw. "I used to treat farm dogs all the time," Evelyn said softly. "They don't fight the pain like we do. They just endure it." Jack nodded, voice low. "He's tougher than he looks." Evelyn smiled faintly. "So are you." For a while, neither spoke. The fire crackled, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Shadow lay curled beside Blaze, his nose pressed against his brother's bandaged paw, refusing to leave. Evelyn stood, wiping her hands. "He'll limp for a few days, but he'll be fine. Keep the bandage dry. Change it every morning. You did good, Jack." Jack stared at the sleeping pup, then at his own trembling hands. "I didn't do enough," he murmured. "You did exactly what you were supposed to," Evelyn replied. "You came back for him." Her eyes softened. "Not everyone does." She stayed for tea while the storm outside thickened again. Jack noticed the way she moved around the small cabin as if she belonged there, her calm presence filling the space that once felt empty. When she left, the snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes, the kind that muffled the world. Jack sat beside the fire, Blaze nestled between his knees, his tiny chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. He ran a thumb gently over the pup's head. "You hear that?" he whispered. "We made it, all of us." Shadow looked up from the hearth, his eyes reflecting the flames. Jack met his gaze, "I saved him," he said, voice barely audible. "I actually saved him." He leaned back, feeling exhaustion settle over him. But it wasn't the hollow kind. It was the weight that comes after doing something right. "I won't lose anyone else," he said, more to himself than the dogs. "Not again." Outside, the snow kept falling, soft and endless, covering the tracks that led into the forest, the trail that had nearly taken Blaze away. But inside, near the glow of the fire, 3 survivors breathed in unison, safe and whole beneath the storm. By late February, winter in the Bighorn Valley had begun to shift. The mornings were still bitterly cold, but the afternoons carried a fragile warmth that hinted at change. The snow no longer fell in heavy silence, but drifted down in thin, lazy flurries that melted before touching the ground. From the cabin porch, Jack Mercer could hear the distant groan of the river beginning to wake beneath the ice. It was the sound of winter surrendering, reluctantly, piece by piece. He stood outside, wrapped in his faded navy parka, watching as the smoke from his chimney rose straight into the calm air. Shadow trotted beside him, alert as always, while Blaze, still limping slightly from the snare wound, chased clumps of snow with the restless joy of youth. Jack smiled faintly, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're not supposed to be running yet," he called, though his tone was more amused than stern. Blaze barked in reply, the sound echoing faintly through the trees. It had been nearly 2 weeks since the accident. The pup's leg had healed better than expected, and Jack had followed Evelyn's instructions carefully, changing the bandage, keeping the wound clean, and gently exercising the leg. The routine gave him purpose, something solid to hold on to. Every morning, he woke before dawn to feed the dogs and tend to the cabin. Every evening, he wrote a few sentences in a notebook Evelyn had given him. A habit she said might teach him how to let the good things stick. That morning, as the sun climbed higher, the air grew strangely quiet. Even the birds had stilled. Jack's instincts, the ones that had kept him alive through war and wilderness, stirred uneasily. He scanned the landscape. In the distance, beyond the frost-coated pines, the river shimmered faintly, a thin white line splitting the valley in two. Then he saw movement, a flash of brown against the pale ice, something struggling. He grabbed his binoculars and focused. About 50 yards from shore, an adult deer, young by its antler size, was trapped midway across the frozen river. Its front legs were splayed awkwardly, its hindquarters half submerged where the ice had cracked beneath its weight. Each time it tried to pull free, the edge broke further. The creature was panting, eyes wild with panic. Jack muttered a curse under his breath. The current there was deceptively strong, slow on the surface, but deadly underneath. "Stay," he told Shadow and Blaze, already knowing they wouldn't listen. He ran back inside, grabbed a coil of rope and his old Navy rescue harness, then sprinted toward the river. Snow crunched beneath his boots, and his breath came out in sharp, white bursts. The dogs followed at his heels, Shadow moving in controlled strides, Blaze hobbling to keep up, but refusing to stay behind. When they reached the riverbank, Jack crouched low, assessing. The ice closest to the shore was thick, but further out, it shimmered a pale blue, thin, fractured. "It's suicide," he muttered, but his hands were already looping the rope around his waist. Shadow barked once, low and urgent, as if understanding. Jack met his gaze. "Keep him back," he said, nodding toward Blaze. The older pup seemed to grasp the command, positioning himself like a sentry at the river's edge. Blaze whined but stayed put, pacing anxiously. Jack tested the ice with his weight, each step careful and measured. The sound of cracking filled the air like distant gunfire. The deer let out a desperate bleat, its strength fading. "Easy, easy now," Jack murmured as he moved closer, his breath fogging before him. "I'm coming." When he was 10 feet away, the ice groaned beneath him. He dropped to his knees, distributing his weight, crawling forward inch by inch. He reached the rope toward the animal, but the deer flinched violently, sending another sheet of ice collapsing beneath its hind legs. Freezing water surged up, splashing across Jack's arms. The cold bit deep, but he kept moving, looping the rope around the deer's chest just behind its shoulders. "Hold on," he whispered, bracing his boots against the solid edge and pulling with everything he had. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a wet snap, the deer's body slid forward onto firmer ice. The weight shift sent a loud crack through the surface, and Jack's world dropped. The ice beneath him shattered, plunging him waist-deep into the freezing water. The shock stole his breath. He gasped, clinging to the rope as the current tugged viciously at his legs. "Shadow!" he shouted, his voice raw from the cold. Shadow barked, then darted forward along the bank, grabbing the rope's end in his teeth. He pulled, straining with all his small body could give. Blaze, despite his healing leg, rushed to help, tugging beside him. The rope tightened. Jack planted his elbows against the unbroken ice, forcing his body upward inch by inch. His arms burned, his fingers numb, but he kept his grip until finally he rolled free onto solid ground. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, water freezing instantly on his clothes. The deer, miraculously, was still alive, trembling, exhausted, but breathing. Jack pulled himself up, coughing, and unhooked the rope. "Good job," he rasped to the dogs. Shadow barked twice. Blaze pressed his head against Jack's leg, tail wagging weakly. The sound of an approaching engine cut through the quiet. A snowmobile came sliding down the slope, kicking up a spray of powder. Evelyn Brooks was at the helm, her silver braid whipping behind her, a wool blanket and a canvas medical kit strapped to the back. She stopped beside him, eyes wide. "Lord have mercy, Jack. You're half ice already." He gave a shaky grin. "You're late." She rolled her eyes, but was already moving, her hands brisk and sure. "You pull a deer out of the river, and suddenly you've got jokes." She knelt beside the animal, checking its pulse. "It's hypothermic, but strong. If we get it warm fast, it'll live." Jack nodded, still trembling from the cold. Evelyn wrapped the deer in the blanket, layering dry canvas beneath it to keep it from losing more heat. "We'll take it back to my barn," she said. "The stove's still going from this morning." Together, they loaded the animal onto the sled. Shadow and Blaze trotted behind as Evelyn drove, Jack seated beside her, his clothes stiff with frost. The wind cut like knives, but the warmth of motion and purpose filled the silence between them. At the barn, Evelyn worked with quiet efficiency, drying the deer and rubbing circulation into its limbs while Jack built a fire. The air filled with the mingled scents of hay, smoke, and life. After a while, the deer's ears twitched. Its chest began to rise more evenly. "You did good," Evelyn said softly. Jack looked up from his seat by the fire. "I don't know about that," he murmured, almost froze doing it. Evelyn smiled, the lines around her eyes softening. "That's what makes it good. Courage isn't about where you fight. It's about why you do it." She touched his shoulder gently. You don't need a battlefield to be a hero, Jack. Out here, you're still fighting, just for different lives. Jack didn't answer right away. He watched as the deer stirred weakly, then rested its head back down. Shadow and Blaze were lying beside each other near the fire, half asleep, their bodies steaming faintly from the melted snow. He exhaled slowly, a long breath that felt like release. When the deer was strong enough, they led it outside. The creature hesitated at the barn door, then bounded clumsily into the snow, disappearing between the trees. Jack stood there watching until it was gone. The sun was setting behind the ridge, painting the snow in hues of gold and crimson. Evelyn looked at him, her expression calm, proud. You see, she said softly, you didn't need to save the world, Jack. Just one life at a time is enough. He smiled faintly, his breath forming a cloud in the fading light. Maybe, he said, but it feels like saving a piece of myself too. The storm came without warning. One moment, the afternoon sky over the valley was a dull, steel gray, and the next, it was swallowed whole by a wall of white. Wind howled through the trees, tearing snow from the ground and hurling it sideways like shards of glass. Jack Mercer had felt storms before, in the mountains, at sea, and in deserts where the air itself could strip you raw. But this one was different. It carried the weight of something personal, as if testing the life he had only just begun to rebuild. He stood by the cabin window, watching the trees bend under the force of the wind. The world outside had dissolved into chaos. Shadow paced restlessly near the door, his dark fur rippling every time the house creaked. Blaze lay beside the stove, ears flattened, eyes darting with nervous energy. The storm had turned the afternoon into a false night, and the light from the fire flickered across the walls like ghosts. Jack reached for the small radio Evelyn had given him, a battered, army green handheld unit, reliable enough within a few miles. He pressed the call button. Evelyn, do you copy? Static answered. He tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing. He turned toward the window. Beyond the swirling white, somewhere over the ridge, was her farm. Old, wooden, sturdy, but not built to stand against wind like this for long. He pulled on his parka, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. Stay, he told the dogs, though even as he said it, he knew they wouldn't. Shadow pressed against his leg, Blaze limping to his side, eyes wide but determined. All right, he muttered, but you keep close. No heroics. The moment he opened the door, the wind punched through the cabin like a living thing. Snow blasted into his face, blinding and sharp. He wrapped his scarf tighter and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him instantly, burning through the fabric, biting into his skin. Each breath felt like inhaling broken glass. The world was noise and motion, a whiteout where horizon, ground, and sky became one. They moved slowly, step by step, guided by instinct more than sight. Shadow trotted ahead, following the faint scent of Evelyn's property carried through the wind. Blaze followed just behind Jack, staying close enough that their shoulders brushed. The snow deepened as they climbed the ridge, rising to Jack's knees, then his thighs. Visibility was almost zero. Halfway across the ridge, Shadow stopped abruptly, barking into the wind. Jack squinted through the storm and saw something dark half buried in the snow, a shape that didn't belong to the landscape. He waded forward, brushing aside the snow until he saw what it was. A dog, larger than Shadow, with a thick golden coat matted by ice and dirt. Its ribs showed through the fur, and one ear was torn. A frayed rope still hung from its neck, as if it had broken free from somewhere. Jack knelt, brushing snow off its muzzle. The dog opened its eyes, amber, wary but alive. "Easy, boy," Jack said softly. "You're all right now." The animal whimpered, too weak to move. Shadow approached, sniffing cautiously before giving a short, approving bark. Blaze wagged his tail once, as if to say, "Let's bring him home." Jack hesitated, looking toward the storm-dark horizon where Evelyn's farm would be. He could feel the cold seeping into his gloves, numbing his fingers. The logical choice was to turn back. The human choice, the one Evelyn would make, was to keep going. He exhaled sharply, slung the golden dog over his shoulders, and continued into the white void. Each step grew harder. The wind screamed across the ridge, tugging at his coat, trying to push him off balance. He bent low, shielding the injured dog with his body. Shadow and Blaze flanked him, their shapes ghostly against the blinding snow. Time became meaningless, just a blur of white and breath and pain. When he finally saw the outline of Evelyn's farmhouse through the haze, he almost thought it was a mirage. The roof was half buried, the chimney puffing weak smoke. He forced himself forward, shouting her name. "Evelyn!" His voice vanished into the wind. Then, faintly, a light flickered in the window. He stumbled up the porch steps and pushed through the door without knocking. Inside, the air was dim and thick with cold smoke. Evelyn Brooks was sitting near the stove, wrapped in a blanket, her face pale but calm. The glass panes of her windows had frosted over from the inside. She looked up, surprise and relief colliding in her expression. "Jack, dear Lord, I thought..." He lowered the golden dog gently onto the floor. "You're not answering your radio." "The line went dead hours ago," she said, standing unsteadily. "The wind took down the tower. I was waiting it out." He removed his gloves, kneeling beside the new dog. "You've got another guest?" he said, forcing a half smile. Evelyn crouched beside him, examining the animal with quick, practiced movements. "Male," she murmured. "Looks like a retriever mix. Frostbite on the paws, maybe dehydration. Whoever tied him up must have left him to die." Her tone was matter-of-fact, but Jack saw her jaw tighten. The same quiet fury she'd shown when she talked about her late husband's rescues. "Can he make it?" Jack asked. "If we get him warm," she replied. "You carried him here?" He nodded. Evelyn gave him a long look, half admiration, half exasperation. "You really don't know how to stay inside when the world falls apart, do you?" Jack shrugged off his coat, his voice low. "Guess I'm learning from you." Together, they worked through the night. Jack repaired the fire while Evelyn treated the dog's paws with warm water and salve. Shadow and Blaze lay near the stove, exhausted but alert, watching every movement. The wind battered the walls outside, howling like a wounded animal. But inside the cabin, there was warmth, the kind that came from shared effort. When the dog finally stirred, letting out a low whine, Evelyn smiled faintly. "He's a fighter," she said. "Needs a name." Jack leaned against the wall, wiping sweat from his forehead. "How about Storm?" Evelyn chuckled. "Fittin'. You two found each other in one." As the hours passed, the storm outside began to fade. The wind softened, the snow slowed, and the silence returned. Heavy, but peaceful. Jack checked the window. The first streak of dawn was breaking through the clouds. The valley looked transformed, buried, gleaming. Alive again, Evelyn poured 2 cups of coffee, her hands steady now. "You know," she said quietly, "you didn't just save me, Jack. You brought life back to this place, to me." He looked up from where Shadow rested his head on his knee. Blaze curled beside Storm. "We all needed saving, I guess," he said. She smiled gently, the firelight catching the silver in her hair. "No, Jack, you didn't just save us." She paused, her eyes kind but sure. "You saved your own heart." Jack didn't answer, but as he looked around the small, storm-warmed room, the dog sleeping peacefully, the light returning, he felt something deep inside him shift. For the first time since leaving the Navy, the silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like peace. Tom ta tieng viet. Mot kon baun tu yet du dui but ngo ap jen hien tin hiu lien lak biket. Jack lo lang ki kong lien lak juok, voi Evelyn nen quiet jin vuat baun jen trang trai kwa ba. Sung Shadow va Blaze. An bang kwa gyo tu yet. Kiwa juong ku juok, mot koncho hoang gyong retriever jang hap hoi. Du kietsuk. An van mang no teova tim, thay Evelyn and Toan. Ho kung hao suoi, am vasham sok shu ho. Jaten no la storm. Kibao tan, Evelyn noi. Kau hong chiku toi, Jack. Kau ku shin traitim ming. By early spring, the valley began to breathe again. The snow melted in quiet streams that ran through the tall grass, and the air smelled faintly of thawed earth and pine sap. The storms had passed, leaving behind broken fences, fallen branches, and an odd kind of peace. Jack Mercer stood outside the cabin with a hammer in one hand, the sleeves of his worn flannel shirt rolled up, and the sunlight falling softly across his face. For the first time in months, he wasn't bracing against the wind. He was working with it. Shadow lay nearby, chin on his paws, watching intently as if supervising the project. Blaze, healed but still prone to bursts of reckless energy, darted around the clearing, occasionally stealing small tools from Jack's work table and forcing him into half-hearted chases. Storm, the golden retriever they had rescued during the whiteout, was still lean but stronger now. He carried small planks in his mouth like he had something to prove. The project had started as a simple idea over coffee a week after the blizzard. Evelyn Brooks, bundled in her green wool coat and a scarf the color of twilight, had sat across from Jack at the cabin's rough-hewn table. "You can't keep bringing them all inside," she'd said with a smile, nodding toward the 3 dogs sprawled by the stove. "You need a proper place, something between the wild and the warm." Jack had leaned back, rubbing the scar on his knuckle, a habit whenever he was thinking. "A shelter?" "Not a shelter," she'd corrected, her tone soft. "A haven, a place for healing, for them, and maybe for you too." And that was how Haven Hollow began. They cleared the patch of land behind the cabin where the trees opened into a gentle hollow, framed by birch and spruce. Jack cut lumber salvaged from an old shed, while Evelyn coordinated supplies from the nearest town. The structure slowly took form. 3 small enclosures for animals, a covered area with straw bedding, and a fire pit for warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough. That morning, as he drove the final nail into the wooden sign above the entrance, he stepped back to look at the carved letters Evelyn had painted by hand. Haven Hollow. Her handwriting was steady, old-fashioned, with a kind of grace that made the words seem alive. She approached from the path, carrying a wicker basket filled with bread and herbs. Evelyn had changed since that first storm months ago. The sadness in her eyes had softened into something brighter, steadier. Her silver hair was braided neatly, and her steps, though slow, carried quiet purpose. "Looks like a proper sanctuary now," she said approvingly, handing him a piece of bread. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead. "I'm not much for pretty signs," he admitted. "You're more of a build it sturdy, let it speak for itself man," she said, smiling. Robert was the same way. Her voice wavered briefly at the mention of her late husband, but she continued. "He used to say, you can't save every creature, but the ones that find you, those are your responsibility." Jack nodded, glancing toward the dogs. "Guess I've been found a few times." The sound of laughter broke the quiet. Down the hill, a small group of children were trudging up the path from town, guided by a woman in a long brown coat. She was in her early 40s, tall and composed, with copper blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail. Her name was Sarah Lindholm, the new school teacher in town. She'd come to Wyoming from Portland after a divorce, trading city noise for the silence of the mountains. Her expression was both kind and cautious, the look of someone still learning how to trust the world again. Evelyn waved. "Right on time." Sarah smiled as she approached. "You weren't exaggerating, Mrs. Brooks. This place is beautiful." Her voice carried warmth, low and calm, instantly putting the children at ease. They ranged from 8 to 12 years old, bundled in mismatched jackets, cheeks flushed from the climb. Jack shifted slightly, unused to so many visitors. Didn't expect a whole troop. "They've been reading about wildlife rescue in class," Sarah said. "And when I told them about you and the dogs, they begged to come see." She lowered her voice slightly. "You might find they're better helpers than they look." The children immediately scattered under Evelyn's direction, refilling water troughs, laying out blankets, and carrying straw to the pens. Shadow followed them with quiet authority, while Blaze bounded among them like a joyous whirlwind, earning delighted laughter. Storm stayed near Jack, sitting tall and regal like a guardian. Jack found himself giving quiet instructions, explaining how to tie a proper knot, how to move gently so as not to startle the animals. His voice, once hoarse from disuse, grew steadier. One boy named Caleb, small with freckles and a wool cap 2 sizes too big, worked beside him silently for a while before asking, "Mr. Jack, were you in the Army?" Jack paused, hammer in hand. "Navy," he said after a moment. "Long time ago." "My granddad was too," Caleb said. "He said soldiers don't stop fighting. They just find new battles." Jack looked at him, surprised, then smiled faintly. "Smart man." When the work was done, Evelyn set out bread and stew for everyone. The group gathered around the fire pit while the dogs rested nearby, half asleep and content. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, something Haven Hollow had never known before. As the children prepared to leave, Sarah lingered behind, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've built something good here," she said to Jack. He shrugged lightly. "Couldn't have done it without help," she smiled. "That's the best kind of work, the kind you don't do alone." There was something in her tone, admiration, maybe recognition, before she turned to help the children down the path. As the last of their voices faded into the trees, Jack leaned against the fence, looking at the hollow they had built. The pens stood solid and warm, the sign catching the last gold light of sunset. Evelyn stepped up beside him, her hands clasped over her coat. "You see that?" she said softly. "All those little hands, all that laughter. That's what hope sounds like." Jack nodded, watching the dogs wander lazily between the pens. "Feels strange," he said. "Having people around again? Feels good." Evelyn smiled, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You've learned something, Jack. Kindness spreads like fire, but this kind doesn't burn. It warms." He looked at her, then at the dogs, then at the quiet sanctuary bathed in the fading light. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just living here anymore. He belonged here. Haven Hollow wasn't just for the animals. It was for every soul that had ever been lost and needed to find its way home. The morning mist rose slowly over Haven Hollow, soft and white, curling like smoke from the thawing earth. The valley had settled into that rare stillness between seasons, when the snow was gone, but the grass had not yet turned green, when the air carried the scent of rain and renewal. Jack Mercer stood at the porch railing, sipping black coffee from a tin mug, his gaze lost in the fog that rolled lazily across the trees. Beside him, Shadow and Blaze lay shoulder to shoulder, tails flicking idly, while Storm sat a few steps away, watching the hollow as if on guard duty. Life had become a rhythm again, steady, purposeful, and almost peaceful. Jack spent his mornings mending fences or building new shelters for animals brought in by the townsfolk. Evelyn often joined him, her quiet laughter and simple wisdom filling the air like birdsong. Sarah visited every few days, bringing school children who fed and cleaned, their laughter turning Haven Hollow into something that felt like family. But that morning, as Jack turned toward the cabin door, something unusual broke the routine. A postal truck, rare in those parts, rumbled up the dirt road, its tires kicking up a cloud of dust. The driver, a middle-aged man with a sun-cracked face and a blue cap too big for his head, leaned out of the window. "Delivery for Jack Mercer," he called, holding out a single envelope. Jack wiped his hands on his jeans and approached. The man tipped his cap politely. "Came through the veterans office. Looks official." The envelope was thick, cream-colored, stamped with the insignia of the U.S. Navy. Jack felt the air tighten around him. He thanked the driver, then turned the envelope over in his hands. His name was printed neatly in black ink, and beneath it, the words, "Naval Operations, K-9 Division Rehabilitation Program." Inside, the letter was brief but heavy. It came from Commander Alan Reeves, his former superior, a man Jack hadn't spoken to in years. Reeves had been the kind of officer who led by doing. Tall, square-shouldered, always with a 5 o'clock shadow and a voice that carried more gravel than patience. He had lost part of his hearing after an explosion during an operation overseas and had since been reassigned to training divisions. He was known for his bluntness, but beneath it, there was integrity. The kind soldiers followed without question. The letter began formally, then softened midway. "Mercer, we're starting a rehabilitation program for veterans with PTSD, integrating canine therapy and rescue work. We need someone who understands both sides of that leash. You've always had that instinct, even back when you didn't believe it yourself. If you're willing, I'd like you to join the program as a lead instructor at the training facility in Denver. Think about it. The work matters. A. Reeves." Jack read the words twice, then folded the letter carefully. The world around him seemed quieter somehow, as if the hollow itself was waiting for his reaction. Evelyn found him sitting by the fire pit later that afternoon, the unopened envelope beside him. She wore a light brown sweater, her silver braid draped over one shoulder, and carried a bowl of stew in her hands. "You've been staring at that letter for an hour?" she said gently, setting the bowl down. Feels like it's staring back, Jack murmured. She eased herself onto the bench beside him. Old ghosts? He nodded slowly. Reeves, my old commander, wants me to go to Denver, train dogs for veterans, says it's therapy. For them, for me. He gave a hollow laugh. I don't know if I can go back to anything that wears a uniform, Evelyn. She studied his face for a moment, the firelight reflecting in her eyes. You think going back means going backward, she said, but maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just bringing the best of what you were into, who you are now. Jack didn't respond. The flames crackled between them. Somewhere nearby, Blaze barked at a rustling bush, while Shadow trotted off to investigate. Evelyn watched them with a small smile. You know, she said, you've already been doing what that letter asks. You've trained those two better than any handler I've ever seen. And look what they've done. They've healed you. Jack leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Back then, I trained dogs for combat. Now, I don't even want them near harm again. It feels wrong. Then don't train them for war, Evelyn said softly. Train them for hope, for rescue, for companionship. Teach the soldiers to build, not to fight. Her words settled over him like warm air after frost. He stared into the fire, watching the embers pulse red and gold. I wouldn't even know where to start. Evelyn smiled. You already have a start. You just need to give it a name. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. The letter sat on the table beside his bed, lit by the flicker of the lantern. He ran his fingers over the Navy SEAL, memories surfacing unbidden. Faces, orders, the sound of helicopter rotors in the dark. And then, other images. Shadow pulling Blaze from the trap. Storm shivering in his arms during the blizzard. The children laughing as they brushed hay from their boots. When morning came, he stepped outside to find the valley glowing in pale sunlight. Sarah was there with a group of children, unloading supplies from her truck. Blankets, canned food, and old dog leashes donated by the townspeople. We thought Haven Hollow could use a little more love, she said with a grin. Jack helped her unload, his mind still distant. When they finished, she looked at him curiously. You okay? He hesitated, then handed her the letter. From my old unit. They want me to train dogs again. Veterans this time. Sarah read the first few lines, then smiled gently. You should do it, in your own way. You don't have to leave this place to lead. That night, he lit the fireplace and sat with his notebook open, Evelyn's words echoing in his mind. Train them for hope. He looked around the cabin, at the 3 dogs resting in a tangle by the hearth, at the shelf lined with medicine and rescue gear, at the hand-painted sign outside that read, Haven Hollow. The decision came quietly, without ceremony. He picked up his pen and began to write a new sign. Veteran K9 Training, Haven Hollow Program. Beneath it, he scrawled a motto that felt truer than anything he'd said in years. Not to fight, but to heal. The next morning, Evelyn arrived early, carrying fresh bread and a knowing smile. So, she said, glancing at the new sign on the porch wall, you made your choice. Jack nodded, resting a hand on Shadow's head. Yeah, I think Reeves will understand. Evelyn's gaze softened. He will. Because you're not going back to the pain, Jack. You're bringing the light forward. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt the weight of his past ease. Not disappear, but settle into something he could carry. The Hollow had become more than a refuge. It was a bridge between who he had been and who he was becoming. Outside, the dogs ran freely across the field. their paws kicking up small clouds of dust. The sun broke through the morning mist, flooding the valley in gold. Jack watched them, a faint smile touching his lips. Somewhere deep inside, he finally understood. The world didn't need him to be a soldier anymore. It needed him to be a guardian. Morning came quietly to Haven Hollow, the kind of soft winter morning where the world seemed to exhale after holding its breath all night. The sky was a pale wash of silver and white, and the first flakes of a late-season snow drifted lazily down, catching the faint light. Jack Mercer stood by the cabin window, the steam from his coffee rising against the glass, watching the flakes twist and fall across the valley. He had come to love this silence, the kind that didn't feel empty anymore. It was the silence of peace, not loneliness. Shadow stirred near the hearth, stretching his long legs before padding to Jack's side. Blaze followed, still playful despite the streaks of gray fur beginning to show around his muzzle. Storm dozed in front of the stove, his golden coat glowing in the firelight, while Evelyn's laughter floated from outside, where she was feeding the hens in their small coop. Life had found its rhythm again. The Haven Hollow training program had been running for 2 months now, and already several veterans had come to learn. To train their own rescue dogs, to rediscover trust through purpose. Jack taught them what he knew about patience, obedience, and partnership. Evelyn handled the emotional side, often with just a look or a quiet word. Sarah helped organize schedules and supplies, her calm voice bringing a sense of order that Jack had once thought impossible to find in chaos. He thought about that sometimes. How life could rebuild itself, not in great leaps, but in steady, tender ways. How something broken could be mended by hands that had known gentleness again. He was turning toward the fire when it happened, a sound that froze him mid-step, a faint scratching at the door. At first, he thought it was the wind dragging a branch across the wood, but then it came again, soft, insistent, fragile. The same sound that had once changed everything. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked. Blaze growled low in his throat, not in threat, but in recognition. Jack's pulse quickened. Slowly, he set his mug down and walked to the door. For a heartbeat, the air felt thick with memory. The first time he had heard that sound, he had been a man trying not to feel. Now, he was something else entirely. He opened the door. The cold swept in like a breath from another world, and in it, 2 tiny shapes trembled. They were puppies, German shepherds, barely 6 weeks old, their fur clumped with snow and ice. One was darker, with a sharp stripe down his back and timid eyes. The other smaller, with tan paws and a faint scar over one ear. They huddled together on the porch, shivering, their paws half buried in the fresh snow. Jack knelt immediately, the air catching in his chest. "Hey, hey," he murmured softly. "Where'd you come from, little ones?" The darker pup whimpered, while the smaller one took a step forward, his tiny paw landing on Jack's boot as if to ask permission to be saved. Behind him, Shadow moved closer, lowering his head until his nose brushed the pup's. A quiet sound escaped him, a soft, rumbling whine that seemed almost protective. Blaze joined him, circling once before sitting beside the newcomers, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes filled with a gentle familiarity. For a long moment, no one moved. The snow fell heavier now, whispering against the roof and the pines. Jack felt something stir deep inside, that same pulse he'd felt years ago when the first 2 had found him. That fragile, unexplainable thread that tied one life to another. Evelyn appeared behind him, brushing snow from her coat. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her silver braid draped across one shoulder. She froze at the doorway, taking in the scene. The corner of her mouth curved into a knowing smile. "Well," she said softly, "looks like the storm's got good aim." Jack looked up at her, his breath fogging in the air. "Seems it always finds its way here?" Evelyn crouched beside him, extending her hand to the smaller pup, who sniffed her fingers before leaning into her touch. "Poor babies," she murmured, "but they found the right door." Jack scooped them up gently, wrapping them in his coat. The warmth of their tiny bodies seeped through the fabric, and the faint tremor of life against his chest brought back every heartbeat, every night, every quiet victory that had led him here. He turned to Evelyn, his voice low. "Maybe it's a sign?" She smiled, eyes glinting. "Of what?" "That the work never really ends," he said, "and maybe it's not supposed to." Inside, the cabin glowed golden with firelight. He placed the puppies on a blanket near the stove, where Blaze immediately settled beside them, resting his chin gently over their tiny bodies. Shadow stood watch from the other side, tail flicking rhythmically, protective but calm. Storm stretched, yawned, and with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like contentment, lay down near the door, the silent sentinel of their small, ever-growing family. Evelyn sat on the rocker near the window, her eyes soft as she watched the scene unfold. "Do you ever think," she said quietly, "that the snow knows where to send them?" Jack chuckled. "I used to think storms were just bad luck. Now I'm starting to think they're messengers." "Maybe both," she said, smiling. "But either way, they find their way to you." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a warmth settling in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. Outside, the snow kept falling, blanketing the hollow in soft, white silence. Through the window, the sign Haven Hollow stood proud and steady, the letters glistening faintly under the frost. Jack thought of the years behind him, the war, the isolation, the cold nights when he had believed he'd been forgotten by the world. And then he looked around, at Evelyn humming softly, at the dogs curled together, at the newborn life that had found his door once more. He realized the truth Evelyn had known all along. Redemption doesn't come once. It comes every time you choose to open the door. The fire crackled, the snow whispered, and inside, the warmth spread. Steady, alive, eternal. Sometimes, miracles don't come as thunder from the heavens. They arrive quietly, like two trembling puppies on a frozen doorstep, reminding us that even in the coldest storms, God still finds a way to reach us. What happened at Haven Hollow wasn't luck or chance. It was grace. The kind that moves through ordinary hands, through kindness shared, through hearts willing to open their doors. And maybe that's the real message for all of us. You don't have to save the whole world to be part of a miracle. You just have to say yes when compassion knocks. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes that goodness can heal. Leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more true stories of hope, faith, and the quiet miracles that still walk this earth. May God bless you and keep your home warm, even through the longest winter nights.